So we're going to be planting up asparagus today in these raised beds. And Sandra and I took the liberty just, a few days ago actually to assemble these raised beds. These are actually from Gardener's Supply. So we didn't make these ourselves, but you have to actually assemble them. Really like them. They have these little copper caps on the edges. We might even put some like copper tape around the edges too to prevent any kind of slugs from moving in. But I wanted some raised beds because there's certain plants that I don't necessarily, at least at this stage, don't want to plant in the landscape because they have a tendency to spread. And I want to make sure that if I put a plant in the landscape that they could remain in that landscape for quite some time. So these raised beds, I have two of them. You can see another one here around the corner. And we actually bermed this up because it was quite a bit lower. Added some soil and then wood mulched on the top of it. And what we did, just so I could show you the raised beds before we start planting, we have hardware cloth below here. And then I put some cardboard on top of that. And the hardware cloth is so that we don't have like a groundhog or a vole moving in. And we have this in front of a building here, which is eventually going to be the chicken coop, and we're going to renovate this coop as well. So this is going to be really some of our first food production aside from the orchard that we're going to have. And we're placing emphasis on perennial fruits and vegetables. And when I look at the lens of like food production, having a perennial fruit or vegetable is something that we're putting priority over because it's something that will come back year over year. And one of the other lenses that we're looking at is that, hey, we like it, we like to actually eat it, and that it's a versatile vegetable or fruit. Maybe it's versatile because you could cook it or prepare it many different ways, or that you could can it and you could freeze it, you could eat it fresh, things along those lines. And also that it has a high value on the market. That's something that is also really important. And really asparagus fits that bill. So if you see, I have a bunch of asparagus roots. Most of these I actually ordered and got them in the mail, and I'm a little late to the game in planting these. I would have liked to actually plant them in the spring. It's early summer now, so better late than never. And I got many different varieties here. I believe there's Millennium and a few others. And asparagus often comes in 3 different colorways. That's what you often see in the market. It's green, purple, and white. Now, the white asparagus, which is more preferred in Europe, is more of like an intentional chlorosis because they actually cover the green parts of the asparagus to reduce any of the chlorophyll or eliminate the chlorophyll. Now, I don't know whether that has an effect on the asparagus nutritionally, but it is the one that is preferred in Europe. I would say that you rarely see it. You see it more in like the farmers markets. I've seen it in some of the more upscale supermarkets, but it's not typically something that you see in the everyday supermarket. But asparagus means, I think initially the name was spiragi, and I think that usually means to swell. And what that may refer to is that it's these little shoots that come out. You see this one's a purple variety of asparagus. These little shoots start to stick out. You could find another one over here that's swelled even more. This is one of the green varieties. Now it's coming up. It's like a little finger that protrudes and comes up. And that's basically the part that is going to be the edible shoot. So when that actually starts to stick up out of the ground, typically what you do is you want to cut it just right below the soil surface base where it's a little white, and that should actually keep a little longer if you do that. Now, eventually it was called sparrowgrass, and sparrowgrass, so that's like the bird sparrow and grass, and it sounds like asparagus, and I'm not sure if asparagus was misinterpreted or misheard, or sparrowgrass was misinterpreted or misheard, but eventually we have the name of asparagus, which we know today. And if you think that asparagus, the ferny leaves, which actually come up, which I think are really attractive. Let me see. There's one that we pulled out of the landscape here. And you can see that some of these ferny green leaves are coming up, and they get really tall. I mean, they get as tall as a human, and very beautiful. And people use these as houseplants too. So the asparagus sprengii and everything along those lines, if you're familiar with those, or if you go out to warmer climates, some people actually plant the ornamental asparagus, which is not really edible, but the ornamental asparagus, like the foxtail ones, in their landscape. So I always think that's like really funny to see, because those are the ones that typically people will actually grow indoors, at least in colder climates. And I've actually seen these also asparagus growing wild in many parts of the world. And actually that's something I should say. Asparagus has been cultivated for thousands of years, and I think it's always been considered a gourmet vegetable. I do believe that it actually originates from the Mediterranean, and it probably was cultivated in the Balkans. It has been cultivated since the 4th century BC, and you could find it in tombs, depicted in ancient Egyptian tombs. So I think it was really considered always a real gourmet food, because in Egypt it was known as the food of the gods. In Europe it was considered the food of the king or the vegetable of the queens. So, and then even now it typically is a slightly more expensive vegetable. You see it in fine dining. It's not something that, you know, people will generally have with their fries and potatoes, if you will. So, you know, so this is something that we, again, wanted to prioritize. And the reason why I wanted to plant it in raised beds is because these plants, like I said, have a tendency to spread. And just to give you an example, we had asparagus in our garden beds, and as a kid when I was growing up. We eventually sold my childhood home, and 20 plus years later, you go back, they had removed the garden beds, but what they couldn't remove was basically the garlic and the asparagus. The asparagus still comes up. And that's something to say about this perennial crop. You plant it once, it will continually produce for you for 20 plus years. So it might start to wane off after that 20-year mark, but it will still produce, but maybe not as much. And it's also a long-term crop. If you're growing it from seed, it really won't start producing for you until year 2, and definitely in year 3. And as it starts to age a bit more, you'll be able to harvest off it a bit more. Year 5, I think, is actually where you start to harvest, you know, the most. So part of the reason I got these is that I'm not doing any seed starting right now, and these are basically 2-year roots. So you can see what this looks like. And it's funny because this is when asparagi, if it does mean to swell, you could see that these roots are very succulent and thick, and also the sprouts come out like very succulent and thick. The only thing that's not succulent is really the leaves, because they're very ferny and lacy. So you can see it kind of looks like a funky scarecrow wig or something. But if you look at how it's shaped, like this triangle, this is how we're going to plant it. You're going to plant it on a mound. So say that my hands are the mound of soil or compost, and you're just going to drape it over like this. And we have about, I would say, 16 or 17 of these, maybe 18, I don't know, because we pulled some out of the ground here that we found in an area that used to have raised beds. So we're going to try to salvage those. I think it's going to be a little tight, but I'm going to try to fit 8 to 9 in each of these containers. And honestly, if it's too tight, because you want to get them about 12 inches away from one another, if it's too tight, that's okay, because I could always pull them up and plant them elsewhere. But the key is that I actually want to get these planted. And what we have to plant them, Espoma Organic Raised Bed mix. I have some Espoma Organic garden soil, and have some really beautiful compost as well. I'm really excited that we're starting to get our compost game on here too, so there's a lot to choose from. But basically I'm going to do a nice mix. And asparagus does want to have a really well-draining mix, so the benefit of actually keeping it in a raised bed elevated off the ground is that it's not going to get saturated. Our soil here is heavy in clay, so I think it's going to appreciate something that's a little bit more augmented. You could control that a lot better. But notice we have the hardware cloth, so you could get the benefits of earthworms and microbes coming up from the bottom as well, without the vole pressure, if you will. So I'm just going to get started and start putting some of this stuff in here. Just so I could have something to work with. And you can see with this raised bed mix, it has their earthworm casings, micotone, alfalfa meal, kelp meal, feather meal. So this already has some nice organic, slow release fertilizers in it. Combined with the compost, this is going to be a really nutritious meal. Some of this garden soil in as well. I'll tell you what, it's such a pleasure to work with really good potting medium and soil, because sometimes, digging a hole in this ground here, you feel like you're walking up a really steep slope. It could be a lot of work. I should say that you're going to want to plant your asparagus. This is about a 14-inch high bed. I'm going to plant the asparagus pretty high up, having 12 inches of soil, because it does like to increase the roots and have the roots grow down. It gets a pretty big, robust root system, as you can imagine, trying to pry it out of your ground and it coming back over many, many decades. It could be very difficult to actually, get up out of the ground. So anyway, what I'm going to do is create these ridges. I'm going to create these ridges here, so I'm going to kind of pretend like I'm creating little sand castles, and that's what I'm going to drape the roots over. I'm going to throw in some of this compost too, which also looks very nice. And again, I'll create those little sand castles, as I mentioned, after I get most of this stuff in, so I have a lot of material to work with. It really helps to have an idea of what you want to plant in your garden beforehand. That's something that actually we're working on and always tweaking. And I knew between the asparagus and sunchokes, which are also called Jerusalem artichokes, that's another plant that I have, that I would prefer to plant in a raised bed, largely because, again, they could spread and they're large and they could get pretty aggressive in the landscape. Not in a bad way. If you want that, that's totally fine. But for me, I want to contain it, especially as we're continually coming up with plans for the landscape where they're going to be. So like I said, this is going to be a pretty tight fit for all the asparagus that I have. I have too much asparagus and too little raised bed, but I do want to get it planted because I'm already late to the game in planting this. And I would like to actually see it planted up and get it started, especially because I'm getting these 2-plus-year-old roots. We'll be able to harvest off of them sooner rather than later. And at 2 years, you could probably harvest for about 10 to 12 days during the year. And then at 4 years, you could harvest for about, 20 of those days, 25. And then at 5 years, you could harvest for probably a whole month, if not more. So here's this first plant. And here's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna drape it in just like that. You see? Spread out the roots. Now I don't know what varieties these are, and I'm not gonna put any information on them. But here, see this? I had this in this compost, and you can already see the little rootlets coming out. So again, I'm gonna plant these a little more densely, but typically they're 12 inches. I might not be able to have as many as I want in here, but might even have to try to do 3 rows. This one right here. And what you want to do is you want to try to get the sprouts. They could be slightly under the soil, but you know, because that's where they actually emerge, is from under the soil, but you want to try to have those up above. Okay, so I'm gonna try to show you this. I'm gonna have the sprout just come up right above the soil, just right here, you see it? So I'm just gonna cover up that lightly. And that's about where I'm gonna have it. And afterwards, we'll water this in as well, of course. Although we will be getting some rain again. And I have to say that we're the lucky ones, because there's many areas right now that are going through extreme drought. And that's something that we don't have a challenge with here in the Northeast in New York. It is getting drier, but we're trying to build our land in a more resilient kind of manner. And luckily, these plants don't need to be babied with tons of water. I mean, if they originated in the Mediterranean, a lot of those Mediterranean plants, like many of our herbs that we love, lavender, thyme, Santolina, all those plants have grown up in hotter, drier environments. So these plants would be great across many different growing zones. Additionally, if you are in an area where you don't have a lot of light, because these do like sunlight. So this is actually south facing. These plants are gonna get quite a bit of light here, which is great for asparagus. But say you have a very shady area and you like the taste of asparagus, well, you might be interested to note that hostas, which are ornamental plants, the plants that we typically will plant in shady areas, they're in the same family of Asparagaceae, and they also get early shoots that reportedly taste like asparagus. So those are often harvested in Asia. We know it as an ornamental plant, but it's actually considered a vegetable in other parts of the world. So I'll be planting hostas and really taking notes and comparing tastes. If any of you have actually tasted hostas or used them like asparagus, let me know in the comments below, because it gives people an opportunity to grow perennial vegetables other than asparagus, but that taste like asparagus. Okay, so I'm mounted up here. I think trying to plant 9 in the bed might have been a little bit more challenging. Look, I have a tiny one right here. This is a nice tiny guy. I'll probably put that one on the edge. I'll berm this up a bit more. Actually, let me berm it up even more, because he's gonna be sitting down too low. And again, I wanna give him at least that 12 inches to go down. And what's great about this idea within this bed is that the roots can actually penetrate and go down further into the earth down below if it wants, because there's that hardware cloth. So it's not eliminating the roots to go, it's not eliminating the roots from going down further, which is also great. Let me plant this guy here. Now, in my estimation, some of these roots look healthier than others, like these nice thick white roots that are getting all these root hairs, these little white root hairs. These plants look a lot healthier than some of those darker colored roots that felt a little bit brittle and dry. I still think all of these plants will produce. They all have shoots coming off of them. But this looks healthier to me, which these nice thick white roots with root hairs. Here's another one. This one looks like a purple variety. You could see that coming up right there. And you know, asparagus, as I mentioned, we grew up having asparagus from our garden, and it tastes so much better than what you get in the supermarket. It's just, I mean, when you grow something yourself, there's pleasure in that in a very deep manner.
Also, the shipment takes a lot of the freshness out of it.
Oh yeah, especially if you're not getting it local. I mean, here we're lucky because we could get a lot of the food grown locally. There's a huge local farm movement here in central and upstate New York. So that we could be lucky from. But if you're going to any kind of traditional market, it's often not grown locally. One of the things I should also say about asparagus is that it is incredibly nutritionally dense. So Hippocrates, has statements about the asparagus, and it was often used for urinary tract disorders or any kind of kidney disorders, or even for the heart. So, and there's a lot of veracity in that because there's been more studies done on the health benefits of asparagus.
Asparagus is definitely a nutritional powerhouse and has a host of medicinal benefits. In Culpepper's Complete Herbal, it says, "It expelleth the gravel and stone out of kidneys, and helpeth pains in the lower back." Some of the substances in asparagus include asparagine, which gives it diuretic properties, and it also has asparaginamide, which has been shown to have cell-repairing abilities in the elderly.
This is a plant, again, that has been revered through time. Was never used for commoners, but now us commoners can actually have it in our gardens because it is more widespread, although it's not one of those vegetables that are widely loved. I just knocked the sprout off of that one. Isn't that a shame? But that will just kind of grow right back. So you gotta be careful because when they're just coming out, they are quite delicate, but they're resilient. I'm wondering if I could get kind of another one right in here. Typically, if people are planting them in their garden beds, they'll have greater rows between them. I'm gonna get two smaller ones because these are two small ones. Look at the little nice root hairs coming off of that. It's already starting to grow. I love seeing that. So let me just put these here. And I could get more bang for my buck. And again, if I have to move them, then I'll move them afterwards. But I'll just be planting a bit more densely. Their roots are going to be touching one another, but I'm working with 2 raised beds here and a lot of asparagus. Okay. So once I get this pretty even with raised bed mix, which is getting there, I'm going to just lightly mulch, just maybe an inch of mulch, hardwood mulch on the top, just to maintain moisture. So when moisture goes in, it could actually maintain some moisture. It doesn't get sun-baked, and it protects all the microorganisms that are going to be growing under here that's going to help get nutrition to these plants. So right now, I'm just going to water this in just to have oxygen get to the roots and let the soil settle. And then I could put some more compost potting medium on top. Oh, this is going to be wonderful. It's a little late this year, but we'll definitely be harvesting asparagus next year, which is so exciting. This is one of the exciting aspects of actually growing your own food, is seeing the fruits or vegetables of your labor come to life and on your dinner table. So I definitely planted more densely in this bed. The second bed that I'm going to be doing will be a little less dense. So that'll be interesting to test if I don't remove any of these, whether this diminishes actually being able to harvest more because they don't have enough root zone. We'll see, but I probably will end up thinning this out as I get more and more raised beds. So this is nice, it's really well watered. I'm going to just add a little bit more compost on top because I have a little more to spare. Just kind of even out some of the low zones here. Should be enough. Again, you just want enough just to cover the top soil. I don't need to over mulch it. But this will protect the top layer of the soil from getting too dry, especially in a raised bed. Because it's raised out of the ground, it could get too dry, so you need to regulate the water in here a bit better. In the winter months, it will actually maintain more of a warmer temperature in the bed.
So will these overwinter?
Yes, they're perennial. So these will come back. That's part of the beauty of placing emphasis on perennial crops, is that they'll come back year over year and they'll only get better, bigger, and you'll be able to harvest more. Remember, on year 5, we're starting with 2-year-old crops here. If not, this one that we pulled out of the ground is definitely older. But we'll be harvesting sooner rather than later. And at year 5, you could harvest those yummy shoots for over a month of time. It'll keep on putting out more and more shoots. That's great. And then you could pickle asparagus, you could can them. They freeze relatively easily. So even though they're only producing over 10 to maybe 35 days out of the year, you could preserve the rest. If you're like, oh, I can't eat any more asparagus, then you have a bit more food security because you could can, pickle, and freeze them. So when I think of what food do I want to prioritize, especially if you have limited space, asparagus really would be one of those ones. And we like asparagus too, which is helpful. You gotta like the food that you grow. I'd say what's the point, but we're growing crops as well that we may not eat, but we like it for the wildlife and the birds, or we like it for ornamental value. So there's other points other than, you know, why would you grow it if you don't eat it? There you go. That's the first bed of asparagus. I'll start on the second one. We'll have this finished up by the morning, and we'll be enjoying asparagus next year.
Are you enjoying the videos we produce? Consider liking, subscribing, tipping, and hitting the notifications bell. It helps support the channel and the greater community. We're reinvesting 10% of our Google AdSense revenue back into the Finger Lakes community, so your viewership and support goes a long way. We'll see you in the next video.